Hello and welcome to Think Ahead, a podcast from London Business School that brings you cutting-edge research, real-world insights, and expert analysis to address the most pressing challenges that businesses and their leaders face today. I'm your host, Sergei Guriev, Professor of Economics and Dean at London Business School. Today we are diving into an issue that's becoming increasingly relevant for businesses and their leaders around the world: polarization. With growing political divides, climate concerns, generational shifts, controversial public figures influencing workplace dynamics, the need for business leaders to navigate those polarization challenges has never been more important. In this episode, we'll explore how polarization has affected business strategy, company culture, leadership decisions. How can leaders foster cohesion in their teams while addressing divisive issues? To help answer these questions and to offer valuable insights, I'm joined today by two distinguished guests: Donal Crilly, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at London Business School, and Lorenza Brescia, Business Leader at Fagron. Donal, Lorenza, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei.
Thank you.
So we are living in unprecedented times. It's very hard even to choose where to start. So many polarizing issues we are facing: climate, geopolitics, healthcare. Everywhere we have political leaders which take very different positions and citizens who disagree with each other much more than before. How does that influence workplace dynamic, corporate strategy, corporate culture? Donal, where are we on this?
First, Sergei, there's nothing novel about polarization. Polarization has existed for a very long time. I come from Belfast, which traditionally is one of the most polarized places within Europe. But I think nowadays what we're seeing is there's a great degree of social acceleration. Things are happening faster. People are moving countries more easily. So we are confronted by new opinions that are perhaps unsettling for us. This creates anxiety. So this is why polarization is becoming perhaps more heightened and more salient issue for corporations. And we see corporations sometimes taking advantage of polarization, perhaps by appealing to certain groups of society who feel disenfranchised by larger corporations. So polarization is becoming a more important issue, but it's not fundamentally something we have not seen before. And I think the remedies to polarization are also those that have existed in the past.
Like what?
Like, for example, if one thinks about, indeed in the Northern Irish context, one sees a degree of bridging polarization, overcoming some of these divides. And the ways of doing so would have been by motivating high-level long-term principles rather than emphasizing the urgency of a solution. Once you emphasize the urgency of a solution, as pressing as that may be, for example, on climate change, people feel anxious. They feel that there is a lot at stake. And this is where we see absolute disagreement. Whereas if you frame the discussion in terms of the longer term, let's say, intergenerational welfare, people are more likely to agree. They agree on principles much more likely than they will on concrete policies to be implemented today.
Thank you, Donal. Lorenza?
Yes, if I think of the workplace and also for my personal experience, what I see is first effect of polarization is tension. And I see this tension in several aspects in the workforce, so in the teams, that have different opinions, that end up to be closed in silos. But I see also for the leaders, because the leaders needs to be at a certain point ready to take a stance and come out and communicate a decision, but also in the shareholders and for a business in the customers, because the customers are more and more attentive on seeing and analyzing the direction that every company takes in these polarization stances.
As a CEO myself, I can see that very clearly when you have pressure from different stakeholders, and Donal does research on how to engage with stakeholders in different environments. But the question is indeed, when you have polarized stakeholders, be it customers, being workplace colleagues from different generations taking very different view, each demanding the corporate leader to take a position on an issue which is actually very divisive. How should we address this challenge?
Yeah, of course. So I think a leader needs to take a stance and a position, in particular, if the polarizing issues is something that touch the values and the missions of their business. In this case, yes, I think a leader should really take a stance and make clear statements if this issue is really linked to that. This will also help the staff and the workforce to be more unified in front of this, if this touch the mission and as I said, the values, in particular the values. If the polarizing issues is not really very linked to the business, it may be better to keep a neutral position in order not to generate even more tension.
So when we talk about polarization, do you have your favorite examples where companies succeeded or failed to navigate this challenge of increasing polarization? Donal?
A useful illustration is the American company Chick-fil-A. It's a company I've written a case study about. And it's famous for having taken a stance that is, let's say, protective of a very traditional understanding of the family. And the owners of this company donated money to certain foundations that were opposed, for example, to same-sex marriage. Now, you may say this has nothing to do with fried chicken. It's not a salient issue in the fast food sector. But what was interesting was that although this stance initially led to a boycott, it also energized some customers to go more frequently to Chick-fil-A. And Chick-fil-A, amongst all fast food restaurant chains in the United States, has by far the highest revenue per branch, much more than McDonald's or KFC. But the example of Chick-fil-A teaches us several important lessons about polarization and strategy. First, Chick-fil-A is a private organization. It is not a publicly listed firm. It is not a university. So one might imagine that leaders of private companies have greater discretion to express their own values on contentious issues than leaders of publicly listed companies. Second, Chick-fil-A seems to have profited from this use of polarization, but its example shows some clear limits. Chick-fil-A entered the UK market in 2019. In the same year, it was boycotted in the UK and had to exit. So this shows that, yes, you may be able to appeal to certain kinds of customers in a certain region of the United States, but will you have global appeal by taking a strident stance on a contentious issue? And third, when I teach Chick-fil-A, I'm struck by how it touches many of our students, many of our participants. Just as many customers in the United States or in parts of the United States were energized by Chick-fil-A's stance, other people are deeply troubled and deeply offended. And I think we have to be mindful of the consequences of engaging with polarizing issues. We may be able to benefit financially from taking certain stances, but we also risk causing social harm.
Thank you, Donal. Lorenza, do you have your own favorite example of success or failure?
Let's change completely sector. Let's talk about healthcare. And for example, the company I work with is called Fagron. If you are not familiar, is a pharmaceutical company that has a very interesting position in the supply chain because we start from purchasing API, so active principal ingredients from everywhere in the world. Then we manufacture and then we sell and we distribute the medicine. So it has a very, very interesting position in the pharmaceutical supply chain, as I said. And we have done quite a lot of interesting activity in terms of polarization instances, like, for example, in ESG. In 2023, we started a series of interviews with our shareholders to understand which were the important assets and the important KPIs that they were monitoring in terms of deciding if to invest or to divest in a business. So we spoke with them, and then we take actions in terms of transparent supply chain, giving back to the country where we buy, giving back to the staff. Then we were also very active. We joined an institution called the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Institution, that is an association of all the main pharma in the world, and we work with them to go through and help and use best practice all together in order to be very transparent and very honest in how we source material. And at the end, we are trying to eliminate all nocive ingredients for the cream and from the products that we manufacture, so that we also eliminate at this point. So I think we have been behaving quite well. We have taken stance in those polarizing issues because they are really in line with our values, and principal value is quality. So all those were online with the maintain of the quality of the product.
So this is going back to Donald's initial comment about values and principles driving the narrative and decisions. But talking about this, polarization is not only about climate today. It's not only about conservative or progressive values. Also healthcare, what we thought is driven by science and experts, is now also becoming a polarizing issue. Very high-level politicians in the new US administration question the science behind vaccines, for example, and we already see that some scholars remove references to vaccines in their research grant proposals, right? How does that affect you? That is your core line of business. To what extent polarization around science of health and pharmaceutical affects this industry?
Yes, Sergei, I think you are right. The healthcare is one of the most polarized industries. And as you mentioned, the COVID-19 vaccine stance was quite polarized. You had several institutions that were celebrating the new technology, the new vaccine, while other institutions, they were really against. Okay, and this limited somehow the adoption of the vaccine and slowed down the innovation. This is just an example. We also have examples in research and development, where, for example, if I think about the stem cells research in 2000, the US government limited the funding and also there slowed down innovation. There are many also new topics like artificial intelligence. If you think about health, AI can be very helpful in terms of diagnosis, but is polarized by the fact that the model have been trained only on certain part of the population. So, for example, the Google AI algorithm is much more capable to spot breast cancer in white women and not in black women. So these and also other, for example, the CRISPR, the gene editing technology is also very polarized, also because it needs a little bit more regulation. People are afraid, are we going to have genetically modified babies or not? So I know there are many companies who are starting to get genetic pools and more regulation. But yes, it's definitely a very polarized industry.
But what does that exactly mean in practice when you talk to your colleagues in the company? And some of them probably have different views. Of course, there is a self-selection of people who have similar views into the industry. But still, I can imagine they have family members, friends who have a very different view on vaccination, on gene editing, on algorithmic discrimination that you mentioned. How do you, as a business leader, address this polarizing environment?
Yes, of course. I think, for my role, what I think it works quite well is to be transparent with the different stakeholders with whom I talk. If, for example, if there is a decision at company level, I like to be transparent and to explain what is the process, the thought process, bring us to take this decision, and also align this with the vision, because we have a vision for the company, and normally when we take a decision, that must be aligned with the vision. So I think transparency in this case is very good to build trust and to bring the staff with us when we take those decisions.
Thank you, Lorenza. Donal, how would you advise business leaders to navigate those difficult challenges?
The most important thing is to correctly diagnose the issue. Is it truly a polarizing issue? And if it is a polarizing issue, is it a sufficiently salient issue to engage with it? By salient, we mean that our stakeholders care, that this issue affects our stakeholders, it affects our customers maybe, our employees, our investors. We can collect data on this. We can also collect data on whether issues are truly polarizing or not. Now, assume that an issue is polarizing, but not very important. In that case, it is better not to engage in the vast majority of instances, because you risk dissuading customers from buying your product, you risk demotivating your employees. And we know that people react much more negatively to stances that they disagree with than they react positively to stances that they embrace. So there is a potential penalty from engaging with too many kinds of issues. If an issue is sufficiently important to our stakeholders and sufficiently polarizing, in that case, we have to be careful. I think it's better in most cases to appeal to these principles, high-level principles, rather than taking a firm stance on specific policies that are likely to isolate many of our key stakeholders. So again, it's applying principles. And an example of a company that has done this in the past might be Starbucks, for example, and the stance towards gun rights, which is a very contested issue in the United States. It's an issue that isn't important in Europe, but it is important for customers. It is important for shareholders in the United States. What was the stance of the then CEO in 2013 when this became a burning issue? It was to communicate that we don't like people bringing guns to our stores, but not to have a de facto explicit ban of people bringing guns. Now, this is something that is going to be mildly disappointing to some people. Some people would prefer a more stringent stance against this issue. But Schulz, the CEO, was trying to navigate these competing pressures by appealing to a higher principle. We don't like guns, but there is a law. The law in particular states allows people to carry guns. We will respect that law. So it's about recognizing an issue as salient, polarizing, and then navigating a stance that tries not to turn away particular customer groups. Because if it is truly a polarizing issue, the risk indeed is taking a strident stance will be very, very costly.
I very much like this framework of not just talking about polarization, but also about silence, and also this important fact that there is an asymmetry of reaction in a negative and positive way. We often have a majority of customers who are not troubled by the company's position, but you don't observe it because these are the critics who are more vocal by definition. To what extent we can influence silence? So you almost are saying if silence is low, don't talk about this, and nobody will talk about this. So you keep silence low by not talking about an issue. To what extent that is in line with transparency that Lorenza was talking about, right? We don't take a position on this issue, we don't talk about this issue, and we hope that nobody notices that we don't have a position on this issue.
The risk actually is that by speaking about certain issues, not only do they become more salient, but they also become more polarizing, because there is some literature, some research in political science that shows issues become more polarizing when they're more salient. So the risk here is that many social activists who are very well motivated, many CEOs who are very well motivated by bringing important issues to the table, risk also making these issues more polarizing. Think about it. Most people, most everyday consumers, don't have very firm beliefs about the vast majority of social and political issues. Most beliefs are not deeply held, they're not very well informed. But once activists bring an issue to the table, people can easily be influenced. But the risk is that they're influenced in a way that increases polarization, because people are not going to engage in depth with data. They're not going to look at evidence for or against particular vaccines. They will be easily seduced by very simplistic narratives. So I would caution against bringing issues to the table in the interest of transparency, because providing data, providing greater transparency could actually come to increase polarization rather than lead simply to everybody being better informed.
Lorenza, do you do that in practice? It's just very hard for me to imagine how a global company manages to avoid certain discussions. Donal has given a very good example of Chick-fil-A coming and exiting the United Kingdom. It's Starbucks is a global company operating not just in the United States, but most importantly within the United States in blue and red states with different gun laws. So how do you work facing the diverse community of stakeholders?
Sure. I don't think it's as easy. I mean, I don't feel we could, for example, talk about supply chain. I don't think we could not disclose how we behave and what we do in our day-to-day. And also because if you think about social media, with social media, people are really much more informed. And changing sector, for example, something that I really care, for example, the fast fashion business that has been very prominent the last years. They have, it seems, very complicated supply chain issues. They came out publicly saying that it wasn't true, that they were using very, very clear and transparent processes, but then it came out against them because that was not what they were doing. So I don't think for each industry is easy not to take a stance in those, because social media are really, really making people much more aware of what's going on.
Yes, I actually myself, I do research on social media and the impact of social media on confidence and leaders. And there are two very salient findings in this literature. One, indeed, is social media has increased transparency a lot. People now know much more about corporate and government leaders, and leaders who try to ignore this simple fact will suffer if you remain complacent and you hope that certain things will not be known. It's indeed hard to imagine. And the other thing is social media contribute to polarization. There are famous studies of what's called Facebook deactivation experiments, where people who spend time without Facebook hold less polarized views on political issues.
And if I can interject, we're not talking about child labor, for example, as an issue on which companies should not take a stance or be transparent, because that is not a polarizing issue. I'm talking about issues that are inherently polarizing. These are the issues that executives have to be careful about taking a stance on. So not child labor, not how we are managing our suppliers. And I think that's quite an important distinction. So we're not saying to hide abuses of our suppliers, but we're saying if it is a contested social and political issue, that's where we be careful.
That would be reassuring if we were not in 2025, where we actually see that some issues on which we had a broad consensus have become divisive and polarizing issues. We are not talking about child labor, but in the US administration today, we have people who do hold views which are different from what we thought would be even a scientific consensus, not even a social consensus. And we saw as corporate leaders who were completely behind certain social consensus before 2025 shifted back in time, saying we are neutral. This issue is not necessarily core to our business, so we follow the U.S. government's guidance on this, right? So in that sense, unfortunately or fortunately, we don't know which issues are going to be polarizing next year. And I guess that affects all industries.
What I see very much also is in staff retention. I think people are today, for what I can see, very careful in saying, is my company really doing what they claim in terms of the values? And I see that many people are very ready to leave a company if those values are not respected.
Yeah, that's a big business decision, how to retain talent. And we are, I think, going to see a lot of interesting developments in 2025, where we saw that California-based tech companies whose employees previously were expressing very progressive views, now with the CEOs taking less progressive positions, more conservative positions on various issues. We will see to what extent that will result in business impact in these companies. And the same is in our business, Donal, in universities, right? We saw very vocal faculty speaking against the current US administration, but we don't see much discussion right now when you see almost like self-censorship being installed under the threat of removing federal funding and other issues.
I think it does have important implications for the university sector. It has implications clearly for freedom of speech and whether academics who are working on some of these contested themes are happy living and working in certain contexts or whether they prefer to go elsewhere. But the issue of the tech companies and their pivot on DEI is also a great illustration of some of the dangers of engaging with potentially contested issues, because frankly, the fact that so many of them can pivot so quickly on this issue shows that it was probably not very seriously meant at the beginning. And this is deeply damaging, because then you have employees who really did believe. In fact, I have work with a colleague here at LBS where we show that employees are often likely to believe and imbibe almost the ideology that is conveyed by their leaders. So you can just imagine how unsettling this is for the employee. One day DEI is one of the most important values of our company. The next day it's no longer needed. What does that employee believe? I think that is actually going to lead to increasing anxiety. And coming back to the cause of polarization, it's likely to aggravate polarization even further. So DEI is a great example of how the actions of leaders to take stances on issues on which they may not have a true fundamental belief can be fundamentally deeply damaging to societal welfare and to even corporate performance.
Lorenza?
Yeah, so DI are very, very important. In my role, I'm very much involved with women health. We are focused on women health, and we run private clinics, all focused on women. And exactly yesterday, I was talking with somebody I know from a big pharma, offering them a day of talks from our doctors explaining many issues related to women health and so on. And the answer has been no, because our D&E programs have been cancelled. So I felt, yes, quite negative in front of this. So I hope leader will not go in this direction.
One of the things which really worries me is diversity is not just an ideological proposition, it's also a business proposition. In your case, in our case, in the business school education, we want diverse faculty teaching students. We want diverse student body talking to each other, because these are future business leaders running global companies. So they need to know how different cultures or different genders function. A board consisting of white men may not be a board fit for purpose, especially in clinics taking care of women's health. And in that sense, when we go back on diversity, we may also undermine corporate performance, not just because we'll lack trust from the colleagues if we change our positions too quickly, but also just on the core business. So far our conversation was somewhat pessimistic and at times depressing. Can we say something positive about polarization, driving change, driving innovation?
Yes, I think there is positivity to discuss about. So we say polarization in healthcare is very strong, and one of the aspects where I see it very strong is about pricing of medication. Okay, we know there is distrust in pharma, high price. Should the government intervene? The pharma saying no, because so we don't spend money in R&D. But this brings also different business models. For example, I was reading like 2 days ago about I'm sure everybody is familiar with GLP-1 injection, the very famous weight loss injection, very expensive. But there is in Stanford University, a group of scientists was able, thanks to artificial intelligence, to create an algorithm called the peptide predictor. And they actually identify in our body some molecules, peptides, that are absolutely able to mimic the GLP-1 molecules without the side effects. So this is a great discovery. So now the team is setting up a startup to go through clinical trials. But this is, in my opinion, a very good example of how a polarization can bring innovation and new business models.
Donal, any positive examples of navigating polarization?
Clearly, I've already explained that some companies can benefit strategically from polarization. But at the societal level, I think polarization can be positive too, because it can help us to check our own biases. What we think of as being absolutely the moral imperative can actually be wrong. And sometimes having or being confronted by people with other opinions is deeply unsettling, but it can be helpful too. You spoke earlier about diversity. One element of diversity is cognitive diversity, differences in how people think. And if we are truly accepting of diversity, we will also accommodate some polarization to the extent that it can also help innovation, as has already been said.
Thank you very much, Donal and Lorenza. That's been a fascinating discussion, and I've learned a lot. I think polarization is there, is not disappearing. As I said, social media contributes to polarization. We live in the world where polarization is multidimensional and multifaceted. And there are ways for leaders to address those challenges, to think about how to navigate this troubling environment. And one of the key takeaways for me was transparency and commitment to high-level principles. So being true to yourself to build trust and bring polarized parts of the team together. So we usually end this podcast with one single signature question to our guests. Thinking ahead, what would be the one actionable item, piece of advice you would give to business leaders and their organizations to manage the impact of polarizing issues in the workplace?
I would say most important things, lead with empathy. So really take care of the people, invest them, bring them in the decision process, ask and listen to different point of view.
Understand the nature of the issue before deciding whether to engage. Is it a salient issue or not? That's important. Is it truly polarizing or not? And if it's both salient and polarizing, that's where you navigate it very carefully.
Thank you very much, Lorenza and Donal, and thank you for joining us today on Think Ahead. We'd love to hear from you. How is your organization managing the growing influence of polarization in the workplace? And what steps are you taking to create a more inclusive, cohesive culture? Please share your thoughts by leaving a comment on Spotify or YouTube, and be sure to use the hashtag ThinkAhead. And don't forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. For more thought leadership from our faculty and to stay updated on upcoming Think Ahead events, please visit london.edu/think. This podcast is a part of the Second 60, London Business School's 60th anniversary initiative, where we are tackling 6 global challenges that are shaping the future of business.